Hi everyone, we'll get going. I'm Barbara Ryan and I'm the chair of EMPA, and we hold this book club called Disaster Diaries once every 6-8 weeks or so. We alternate between a research article, a conversation article or a book. So we're always open to suggestions for our book club. So if you have any, please let us know. I'll get you to go in a minute around the room and introduce yourselves, and then we'll get going on some discussion around this natural disasters, no natural disasters dilemma. So I'm the chair of EMPA, but in my other job, I'm a researcher in disaster behaviour, and most of my research is in communication and community engagement. And my most recent project is for Natural Hazards Research Australia, working on the community experiences of the early 2022 floods in Lismore and sort of northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. But usually I'm working on bushfire because of where I live, which is Toowoomba, and that's more of a bushfire area than a flood area. So I'll go over to Stuart now, because you're on the right-hand side of my screen. So introduce yourself, please, Stuart.
Thanks, Barbara, and g'day all. So Stuart Krolsham, I'm the Regional Commander, Assistant Chief Officer, CFA, but obviously with the change of circumstances been employed by Fire and Rescue Victoria. I was the Incident Controller at Kilmore ICC during Black Saturday, a variety of other incident controller gigs across the eastern seaboard, and probably most recently I was in charge of the defence of Malakuta on New Year's Eve in 2019.
Thanks, Stuart. Glenn.
Hello there, everybody. My name's Glenn O'Rourke. I'm Deputy Captain with Wallumbye Brigade of the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales. I've been a volunteer for 25 years with the RFS, and with really, I guess, over the last 18 years, have been actively involved in running community safety education around bushfire safety, bushfire preparation and bushfire survival planning. So nice to be part of the group.
Angela.
Hi, I haven't been to one of these before, and to be honest, I wasn't 100% sure what I was signing up for, but it just looked really interesting. I work for Yarra Ranges Council in the Emergency Management team, and I'm also doing a Masters in International and Community Development. And so this issue of, is there any such thing as a natural disaster, has come up in some of the reading, and I do find it fascinating because it does shift your thinking. So I guess I'm just here because I'm curious.
Thanks, Angela. Peter, you're next up.
Sorry, I just had to receive an express, if you mean me, because there's two Peters here, but if you mean me.
Peter Randall?
No, that's not me.
Well, you go, Peter, because you're already online. So
Right. Sorry, I missed what we're doing, but you want an introduction?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I work for CFA. I'm a brigade support officer, and I'm interested in all kinds of things.
Thanks, Peter. Peter Randall, are you able to talk? Maybe not. Natalia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalia. Currently, I work as Emergency Management Officer in a local council in Victoria, Southwest. But before work in Australia, I work in a couple of places for disaster response and preparedness. For example, I went to Nepal for the response after earthquake 2015 for capacity building, working with INGO called Red R India. There's also Red R Australia that also come there, but I work under Red R India, and then a couple of jobs for disaster response in Indonesia because I'm originally from there. And of course, there's many kind of disaster in Indonesia. So yeah, I'm really interested in this event. It's my first time also, so like looking forward to just have good discussion with everyone.
Natalia, which council are you with?
I'm working with Korangamite Shire Council.
Corongamite. Yeah, okay. David, how are you?
Hi, Barb. Good to see you again.
Yeah.
I work at Natural Hazards Research Australia, formerly the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. I'm the communications director of the centre, of the new research centre. So we're just getting started with a lot of research projects all around Australia. So I've been long coming to EMPA events over the recent years, and but the first time to this Disaster Diaries event. So looking forward to see what happens.
Thanks, David. Angelo, can you talk?
Yes, hello. Yeah, my name's Angelo. I'm from the Corongamite Shire Council as well. I work as an emergency management officer. And I think the topic of really highlighting the fact that, disasters are not natural is a really important key factor in the emergency management spectrum.
Okay, thanks, Angelo. Anna, can you talk?
Yeah, kia ora. My name's Anna Eisenhut. I'm a communications specialist at Waitaki District Council in the South Island in New Zealand, and I'm a PIM manager as well. So just really interested to talk about things and also how I can communicate that messaging in those events. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Just go down the list because not everyone's showing up as a video. So Scott, are you able to talk? Maybe not. Scott Walker? Here we go. Hey, Scott, can you introduce yourself? We're not getting voice. I'll just go back over to Peter Randall. Peter, are you able to talk at the moment? We can't hear you, Scott.
Hi, Barbara. Sorry, Pete Randall here. Sorry, just having some connection issues. So, rather temperamental connection. Apologies.
No worries. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I can. Good afternoon. My name's Pete Randall. I work at the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority and primarily working in recovery operations, but also recovery planning.
Okay, we're still having trouble hearing Scott.
Can you hear me now?
Got you now.
Okay, I'll leave the video off. Sorry about that. So my name's Scott Walker. I'm the Coordinator for Emergency Management at Dandenong City Council in the southeast of Melbourne. I've been in this role for 4 or 5 years now. So we did the Black Summer bushfires and then all through COVID responsible for our managing that from the council point of view, and also an SES volunteer in my whatever spare time I can find. So pretty keen to learn about the topic today. I thought it was really interesting, so thanks.
Okay, right, let's get to the article. It's quite a quick read, so I hope you all managed to get through it. It's probably an older concept now because UN released this a few years ago, but it's still a discussion that is had in disaster management circles, and one that doesn't seem to be crossing over the line into the media or some areas of disaster management. So probably I'll just ask you all, are you supportive of the idea of the terminology changing around natural disasters, or do you think that that it's still a legitimate term? So shall I go around the room? Is that easier, or shall I just get you to jump in if you've got something to talk about?
I think just
Maybe
go around the room.
Yeah. All right then. So Glenn, you're on at the moment. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I guess I come at it from a community perspective in terms of trying to engage the community and educate the community. And I find that trying to hold on to simplicity and clarity of language is really important. When you think at the moment, we've just introduced the Australian fire danger rating system. So for people not in Australia, we've introduced a new fire danger rating system. So we're trying to educate people in that. We've also got our warnings and alerts that we now applied across all hazards. But that's kind of, we've got some simplicity there. And I guess for me, I look and try to say, well, when people think about a natural disaster, more easily they're thinking of, a bushfire, a flood, a heat wave. Less so for us, an earthquake, a hurricane, or a volcano, some of the more extreme things that we're involved in. While I can see the logic and the rationale for saying that these things are climate change-induced events that's, impacting that, the way I try to tackle that when I'm engaging with our communities is to say, well, look, whether you're committed to climate change, and there's some people are and some people aren't, I talk about the fact that what is happening is that we're seeing more frequency, more intensity of these natural disaster events. And for us in our local community, that is essentially bushfire and flood and, occasionally heat wave conditions. So I guess I'm trying to make sure we understand who's the audience that we need to change this language for, and does it add to the community's understanding, or does it make it more complex and more difficult? So I guess that's my perspective.
Yeah. So is anyone else thinking of this from the community's angle?
Yeah, I am. But
Yep.
I sort of think that I can totally leave the word natural out of this. I think talking about disasters is kind of a common understanding we all have. But I think what's interesting is that when you drop the word natural and accept that some groups are disproportionately more affected by disasters, generally, I mean, there's so many ways that disadvantage can intersect, but if you're talking about socioeconomic, then you've got maybe people who've built in more affordable areas might be more likely to be on a floodplain. If you've got people with disabilities there, I sort of think it brings in ways that we can communicate more about that disproportionate impact that disasters can have.
Yeah. Stuart, what have you got to add?
So I agree with both Glenn and Angela. The main thing for me is that the term natural almost infers that we can't do anything about it, that it's an act of God, it's Mother Nature. And I think the mitigation strategies and the treatments that we put in place can certainly impact the consequences of these events. So that's probably the angle I'm coming from.
Yeah, I'm a little bit the same, Stuart. Yeah. Natalia, what are your thoughts?
I agree with what everyone mentioned before, but I really just want to follow up what Stuart said before. But about that, it's not something that inevitable. Like, I mean, the hazard is there, and we know the risk, and we know some people more vulnerable because of their social, culture, economy position. But we understand by pushing this is really strong message that we can invest more in the mitigation. So it's like, okay, the hazard that's happened, but we can reduce the risk as much as we can by, for example, capacity building, have a good governance, has a better construction, and everything else that we can put there to just have less risk, especially because we don't want to get people die because of the disaster. That's really big, things that we want to reduce more. So I think it's really strong message just to put there for governor, for local council, even for individual to build your capacity, reduce your vulnerability so you can reduce your risk.
Yeah, I think the language is being underestimated here, isn't it? So Anna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, for me, from a PIM perspective, it's changing habits, which take a while, and it will probably be the sort of thing that as we get more used to this, younger people it'll be a habit that they'll just kind of carry on going forward. But I think it's really good way, and it's definitely something that I will be taking forward, especially using extreme weather events, which have been huge here at this point. And so just using that as terminology going forward and just sort of making things better, communicating with the community is something that I do on a daily basis, and I'm always looking for ways to make it better and to make it clearer, so that the messaging gets across to all kinds of people in the community. So it's something that I'm going to be taking forward from today.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, David?
It's interesting. Well, I'm sort of coming from a, like I suppose, a research sort of angle. You know, I'm more than happy for natural disasters to be the wrong term, and we've certainly dropped it from all our communications. We never refer to natural disasters, and if we did, it's a mistake. And please pull me up on it. We know it's out of it, but it's what we struggle with is the replacement for it, because the word disasters doesn't quite sum up everything that the whole spectrum that we're working with, and either does natural hazards in some way. It does a bit. I remember picking up at a conference recently, a couple of years ago, a sticker that had the sticker "good fire and bad fire," for example, you know, and what was good about good fire and bad fire, and this whole concept of fire being good is a good one. And it's in the same way that a lot of water on the ground, it's either a flood or it's a really good thing for the land. So calling things all a hazard is very much a perspective of all things are bad, that I'm not comfortable with often. And we're working with a lot of Indigenous type researchers that to call fire a hazard is not really the way you look at it. It's so much more that in a holistic sense. So I think I'm struggling with finding an alternative. Most unhappy with natural disasters. That's gone. But disasters doesn't quite cut it either. Natural hazards, well, if it's natural, why is it a hazard? So
yeah, good point. I hadn't thought of that. From the good fire, bad fire. Yeah, and when you think about it, floodplains are the most fertile land because of the flood taking the silt across them. But it's the silt that causes, you know, and the water that causes the disaster to happen. That sort of that's a really good segue into my next question, which was at the end of that article they make some suggestions for alternative names, and it's around extreme weather events, extreme geological events, and that type of thing, but it just didn't resonate with me. How about you guys? Yes, Glenn.
I guess one of the things I find it is a challenge, you know, with working with the community, is actually getting them to identify the reality of the risk or the reality of the hazard. You know, often people, you know, we're in a rural community and people will buy a property, come to this rural community, and they're buying, you know, a beautiful place in the bush, and they're not buying, in their mind, a flood hazard or a bushfire hazard. You know, they're actually saying, I bought this beautiful place in the bush and I'm so lucky and this is a lovely community, and really trying to get them to then acknowledge that they're actually have moved into an environment of high bushfire risk, and, you know, seasonally we have high flood risk. So I think that there's in the language, there has to be a sharpness that kind of heightens the kind of sense of hazard. And so for me, when we've talked about a natural disaster, you know, I don't use that language, you know, really in my communications with people, but I can see why it's hard to kind of replace it, you know. And I find hazards is, you know, people kind of don't hook into that as strongly. So there's a real challenge there about trying to really trigger people's acknowledgement of the hazard and the associated risk, and doing that with a kind of some sharpness to kind of get them to have a heightened level of acknowledgement of that risk. So yes, I think there's some challenges here into choosing the right language to help shape that.
That's right. And on the other hand, the word disaster removes it from their realm of what's possible that's going to happen to them. So it won't happen to me is more probably becomes more prevalent if you're talking about a disaster, because Australians never suffer from a disaster survivors themselves. It's always someone else that sort of it's removed from them, and that language, because it's so extreme, probably stops them from making that connection. Natalia.
I just want to come back a little bit what David mentioned about what if a natural hazard. That's really like stuck in my mind. I remember, just want to share a little bit, long time ago, I work with community in, they live 5 kilometers for the crater of, there's a volcano in my hometown called Merapi volcano that they have cycle of like eruption every 5 years and then a big one every 20 years. But how government try to like tell them about the hazard, about disaster, the risk, everything else, but they don't want to move. They still want to live there 5 kilometers from the crater of the volcano, because they think that it's the cycle of the nature of the volcano itself, and they feel like they get all the bless from the volcano by having like really fertile land, and then that's their livelihood. So you can't take people from their livelihood, which make how we work in the disaster management is really complicated. We can't just see about like technical, about science, but we have to see about culture and how people live and everything. So like, how these people not seeing it as a hazard or risk, but just accept that, and they have term of like living harmony with disaster that sometimes it's just like, what is that? But that's what we find in the community, and we sometimes just get busy, or not busy, sorry, to change the term just to like, I'm sure there's a strong message by changing terms to make it more simple, or there's like mission behind changing a term. But again, when we come back to the community, what is the simplest way? And I think we need to learn more from them, because they've been living there and they know more. So yeah, I don't know whether that's related or like, you know, I just, by David saying like natural hazard, what even that is just click in my mind, like people, they just like, oh, it's just natural cycle of the nature. It's not hazard, it's not risk for us. So like, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a cultural aspect to community's interpretation of the range between an environmental event and a disaster. And that makes our job harder, doesn't it? Because if they are, I guess it's good because they're probably more in tune with the environmental conditions that set up the hazard or the event to start with. And I'm starting to sort of go down the track where thinking that from my research, anecdotally, I'm starting to think that there's a link between environmental connection and preparedness for a hazard. And I haven't been able to find anyone that's really explored that. So that sort of makes me think, Natalia, that story about your community makes me think that, you know, there definitely is something in that research topic. David, what are you thinking?
I mean, that was a really interesting point about the volcano. I mean, I suppose does it come down to audiences, which was raised earlier? I mean, from all what I say about hazards being, or there being a natural event, I mean, if someone's house is burnt down or their house is underwater or something, you can't tell them, oh, it's a natural event. Of course, it's a disaster at that point, at that time, to that audience. So it's choosing the right words to the right people. But we all know that's why people live where they are, and that's why farms are where they are, and all that, because the hazards are being kind to them there. And you know, we wouldn't have ski resorts if it wasn't for earthquakes over the last 1 million years or something, because then we'd have no mountains. So yeah, we understand that in a theoretical sense, the natural part of earthquakes and cyclones and storms and floods, but that's not a message you can always tell someone whose house has fallen down and burning down and in the midst of a hazard. So it's a matter of choosing the right words for the right context, I think.
Yeah.
And if I could just add, I think just talking about volcanoes and, you know, the people living in that sort of cycle of life of volcano, there's almost a sense of acknowledgement of that hazard and that risk, and saying, well, we're going to live with that. We understand that, you know, it's a part of the natural cycle of life and we live here. And then I think you just said then, David, about the different audience. You know, I think of, you know, community here. If I look at what happened in Black Summer, you know, for us here, our community was under direct threat from fire, in 3 directions, intense, and people were, felt their lives were threatened. And for many people, they had never experienced a bushfire. We had some new members in our community that had never experienced it. And even those who had never experienced at the level of intensity and threat to their property and to themselves. And so it was almost a once in a lifetime event for them. And even though people that we had done work with, helping them with preparation and planning and putting a survival plan together, this was a significant for them. I don't know that they would have said a natural disaster, but they were really feeling, this intense threat of this wild bushfire that was coming towards our community. And so I think there's the audience issue that David's spoken to, and we've talked a little bit about, but also the difference of the nature of the hazard. So the volcano example is a very interesting one, because it's certainly not one that I have any experience in or any threat of, where I live. But to see somebody talk about their community and have that as a seasonal cyclical hazard that they live with is different to, maybe us talking bushfire or flood to a community and having them think about what they might do to prepare for an event that might unfold and, impact them individually. So I think there's an audience thing, a frequency thing, and there's an intensity thing. Because if a volcano hits, from my limited experience of what I can see on television, these things, just wipe out communities. These are something we can't stand in the way of and stop. They're just going to take their course and cause the disaster that they do. So there's a lot of complexity here, I think, for us to deal with.
Stuart, are you going to add another layer of complexity?
Yeah, and this is a thought bubble that has, and I don't know the answer, so that's my out clause. But maybe as practitioners, we always jump to having to link the event to the consequences. So we're looking at, and maybe we need to look at this in a different way and break it apart. I don't know how we do that, and I don't know if it'll make a difference, but we seem to hit the same obstacles because we try and join the two together. And probably what the example that Natalia just mentioned with the volcano was a little bit of a light bulb moment for me. So yeah.
Yeah, it was a light bulb. I'm just wondering, as you were talking, Stuart, I was just thinking, I wonder if the language around other aspects of our emergency management is preventing our communities from recognizing the way Natalia's community recognizes the inevitability and the value of this environmental activity. So for instance, when we're talking about 1 in 100-year flood, we're allowing people to park in their minds that this flood is a rare occurrence, even though it still could happen every year, and isn't part of the natural cycle of things. I'm wondering if that language sort of feeds into this whole narrative of preventing people from actually recognizing their risk, because that's what it seems to be coming down to in this conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're right. And I just tend to think it's actually the rain event that's the or the weather event that creates the disaster. But and you're right, 1 in 100 year, we've had a flood. I'm right for the next 99. So I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah, Angela. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, there's always one, isn't it? I was just thinking about what Natalia said, and it's really got me thinking, because there's like two extremes. There's the idea that some people have that we should be able to manage, predict, mitigate every single risk. And I know in local council, we get a lot of people that are very angry if they think there wasn't enough burning off done, or those trees should have been cut down, or that there's this idea that somehow as humans, we should be able to control these things, and we're fearful and anxious when we can't. And these disasters remind us, that we're very much at the mercy of the elements sometimes. Because the other side of it is what Natalia is saying, is this idea that we need to learn to live with it, because some of these things are inevitable. On the other hand, then you get the other factors like climate change, where humans are definitely contributing to maybe escalation of risk in some context. So my brain's melting trying to piece all this together.
I know, lots of light bulb moments. Glenn.
I think the your comment you just made about the climate change piece is really important, but it's also, I think, on the ground disconnected for people. You know, it's a little bit what David was saying before. If a bushfire impacts a community, which is, you know, kind of mainly what is my experience, they're not kind of immediately connecting that to things that they've contributed to or not contributed to in terms of reducing or increasing climate change. You know, so while I think it's important, because I always try and stress that what climate change is doing for us is increasing the intensity and the frequency. So I'm really trying to say to people, the world is changing. Climate change is impacting our ability to, you know, just respond to these events, and the importance, you know, you as an individual, as a family or as a household, have to be prepared for more intensity, more frequency. So I'm trying to heighten the focus of people about the hazard, and saying that that hazard is becoming greater because of the impact of climate change. So I'm trying to put those two things together. But I think, to David's point earlier, you know, when a fire comes through and knocks out someone's home, or, you know, damages property or whatever, their disaster is immediate. They've just lost their home, you know. So there's a whole bunch of things now they're trying to struggle with, is how do they recover? How do they ensure their safety? There's a whole different level of intensity happens at a very personal and very focused level. So, you know, it's what's the point of engagement with the audience? Who is the audience, and what's the right language for that audience at that time? That's one, empathetic to the situation, but two, is also appropriate for what you're trying to get, the behavioural change that you need to drive the outcome that you want in response to an event.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I throw something in, and I hope I come through with my connection? I think words really matter, and the words really need to be very specific to the situation. Let's say we get calls sometimes from the community, huge smoke is drifting down the valley. Oh, it's like Black Saturday, and so on. And then you have to tell them, well, I checked the system, there's absolutely no threat to you. They're just burning off up the valley. And in there comes what David said, the good and bad. I always say, and then I ask them, this is actually good smoke. They're preventing fire. So there's good smoke, there's bad smoke. But the words, they come impregnated with emotions, with feelings, and so on, if one doesn't specify. And even for the volcano, yes, volcano, it's another word. Usually you connect it with disaster, but on La Réunion, which is a French, which is an island, French, still French. The volcano actually was the salvation of the slaves that fled their masters, because they could hide there in caves and such, and no one would follow them up there. So just saying volcano, you always, and smoke or fire, you always have to really specify what you mean. Otherwise you get all this loaded content, and everyone makes their associations, and in the realm of disaster, yeah, they're usually not positive.
Yeah, I can give you an example of where the good and the bad argument actually works. So I moved from New South Wales, where no snake is a good snake, to Queensland, where we actually have carpet snakes living in our shed. And I'd come across the concept of a good snake for the first time ever. And Queenslanders are really comfortable with good snakes. But if we get visitors from the south and we take them over to have a look at our carpet snake, they're completely terrified, because they're only used to the concept of a bad snake. So maybe that language could be incorporated in our preparation information. And another thing that sort of backs that up is one of the research projects I did fairly recently was Toowoomba Regional Council in Queensland wanted to know what level of preparation the community had along an escarpment, the Great Dividing Range escarpment area. But they also wanted to know why the community doesn't do much hazard reduction burning. And we found that one of the reasons is that because it's quite a big city, second biggest regional city after Canberra, it has a lot of blocks, subdivided blocks along the range. A lot of people move into the area not having grown up with fire, and there's a real fear of fire. So it's sort of those two things together make me sort of think, well, maybe we need to be changing our language about, in our fire preparation presentations and community engagement. Go, Scott. Haven't heard from Scott yet, so we'll come back to you, Glenn.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Hey, Scott. Scott is the head of the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences at University of Southern Queensland.
Okay, so I'll shut up.
Okay, Scott.
Hi. Oh, did you want me to say something? Or?
You had your hand up, I think. Oh, no, it was Scott Walker who had their hand up just as you joined. So that's the coincidence. Scott, what were your thoughts? Scott Walker, what were your thoughts?
So thank you. And enjoying the conversation. I'm not sure if everybody's aware, a group of 4 councils, Dandenong was one a few years ago, got together and created a website and an accompanying booklet called the Emergency Prepare Project, and I can give you the link. And it's the first time that we were aware of that all the key messages from all the key emergency services were in the one place about mitigation, response, and then what we suggest you do after an event. And because Dandenong's a very multicultural city, we did a lot of research at the time. We found the word emergency resonated most with residents. It was easier to translate that than the words natural disaster or 1 in 100-year flood. But as soon as we started to talk about an emergency, it got attention. So that was pretty good. So in the website that I'll link, we don't talk about natural disasters. We talk about emergencies come in various forms and then go on to describe them. So we also tried to keep the material as graphical as possible. And there's also a translation widget on the website that can translate, I think, into 100 different languages. And it's still active. It's still out there in the community. We've tried to shop it around to organisations at various state and federal levels, and it doesn't seem that a lot of people have the capacity to take it up. But it's still a thing, and we get a lot of positive response to members of the community. So 4 councils created it, I think out of a bit of frustration that there wasn't this type of material out there that we could quickly grab and distribute. CFA had some great material, SES had some great material, but they were all a bit siloed and at the time. So love to get your feedback on it, and I can also, I'll put a link in the chat for everyone to have a look.
Oh, you're on mute, Barb.
Thanks, Scott. Pop it in the chat. That'd be great. Glenn, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to comment. I last year, on behalf of Cessnock Council, facilitated a series of emergency preparedness workshops as part of their seniors festival. And I engaged the local fire and rescue, SES, Red Cross and Rural Fire Service to participate in this workshop. And I guess to the point about, consolidating the information and so on, what I found was again, we used similar language. It was around emergency preparedness. What I found the challenge to be is that we could guide people through a simple 5-step plan that was in place at that time by Resilience New South Wales for how to prepare for an emergency. But where we struggled was getting down to the level of detail by type of hazard. So if you're trying to talk to somebody about bushfire, you need to step people into a level of understanding of the fire danger ratings as drivers to help you for decision making about whether you're going to leave your property or actively stay and defend. If you're in a flood situation, there's another series of, sort of drivers of decision making. So I think there's a lot of value in consolidating this information and trying to align it, but there's also a challenge of getting the planning down to a level of, I guess, specificity that is really useful in the event of the emergency, particularly when it comes to triggers. Just something for consideration.
Yeah. Scott Power, what were your thoughts?
Oh, right. I was just putting it in the chat, but actually it was a bit long. It's related to the chats we've had previously, Barb, and that's just to follow up on Glenn O'Rourke's comment about the impact of climate change, making the intensity and frequency of some severe events, more frequent and more intense. But I think also from a climate science perspective, anyway, the two other messages are, which may be relevant to communication with the public, but you're the experts, not me, is that some hazards are also becoming more widespread. For example, bushfires. And we saw that a couple of years ago, and it seemed to really challenge firefighting agencies around the country. And then the other one is that people are, because of climate change, there's a greater likelihood, and that likelihood's going up in time, that people are going to see severe events that they haven't seen before. So it'll be more intense, or they'll be unprecedented. There's something about it will be unprecedented. So I was just talking to my cousin then, and he was saying that when he bought his property in northern New South Wales, one of the first questions he asked, has this place ever been flooded? And they said no. And so he got flooded. He had to escape by a helicopter from his roof. So it's another reason why climate change is challenging people, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Natalia, before I go on to you, I might just go over to the people on mobile who aren't able to put their hand up. If you'd like to chime in now, if you've got any thoughts on what we've been talking about.
Hi, Barbara. Pete Randall here. Sorry.
Yeah.
I've been listening. Just not contributing. Apologies. Look, I suppose I come from. I'm applying the the recovery lens to this conversation. That's the area I work in. So I'm in the Metro Sydney region. So Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury and other areas heavily impacted in bushfires 1920, and then we've had several floods in our Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley since March 2021, and so I'm thinking of this in terms of recovery and in terms of communities in recovery, and I think probably my thinking is still latched on to some of the earlier questions that you posed, Barbara, but in terms of how the communities that we've been working with perceive of the terminology, I don't think it's just not there initially. I think people just feel they have been impacted by something. And for them it is disastrous. I think it's only with time that disaster impacted folks might sort of, well, not might, some people do get on to thinking about the terminology and what's happened, and then making the stronger linkages with climate change. But look, I suppose in that initial relief and recovery phase, even in the medium term recovery, and we're approaching the 1 year anniversary for our March floods last year, we know we've got people who are still seeking support, and those folks still seeking support are really, the terminology just doesn't really occur to them. They're classified as being disaster impacted.
Yeah.
And there's no sort of caveats placed around that or further descriptors placed around that. So yeah, I suppose I'm just chiming in with my my recovery hat on and sort of thinking about this, but also I suppose thinking in terms of working with communities and working with councils who have been disaster impacted, whether that's by fires or by floods, and looking at how those groups move along that continuum from recovery round into resilience and preparedness, then the terminology starts to become a lot more relevant. But you've triggered quite a few thoughts for me, and everyone here obviously, just in terms of listening to disaster affected folks, and listening more deeply, I suppose, into sort of in terms of how they perceive what's happened to them. And flood is flood's the one. I think you were talking earlier about the flood terminology and annual recurrence intervals and all that type of thing, which people find it hard to get their head around anyway. And we do have a massive issue in the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley around risk, around flood risk, flood perception, but also around the impacts of what is, some of those processes are natural. The deposition of tons and tons of silt and sand on a agricultural property. There are no supports there to provide help to primary producers to move that sand off their property. because our public works advisory regard that as a natural process and a natural deposition. So yeah, there's a lot to it, complex certainly, but no, look, thank you for it's been really great to listen to everyone, and as I say, just a lot of thinking to do now around listening and terminology. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Peter. There are a couple of others we haven't heard from, and I'm wondering if it's because they're on mobiles. So Angelo, would you like to add anything to the conversation at this point? We haven't heard from you yet, and I'm wondering if it's because you haven't been able to butt in when you've wanted to.
I agree with what's been said. I think, it really depends on how a community or person really takes in the information. For example, their perspective on things, on disasters especially, will be influenced by how they perceive things. So when I was doing some research back in Auckland in New Zealand, and the media would often influence how they perceive what would be a greater risk in terms of disasters. So for example, New Zealand, is often plagued by earthquakes. And so if you asked a person who was living in Auckland, which doesn't really have an association with earthquakes, they would see earthquakes as the greatest risk of disasters compared to something like flooding and volcanic eruptions, because it's always in the media. But yeah, so I think it always leads back to how a community perceives a risk, which will influence the understanding.
Yeah, so those of you who are operational in either response or recovery, how would the term emergency fit from your perspective? Maybe if we start with a couple of you who have worked in recovery, perhaps Glenn, your bushfire, you've seen what happens to a community in the months and years after a bushfire. What would the community consider themselves in a disaster zone at that point, or is it still an emergency?
I kind of think that even the language emergency is interesting, because it becomes very focused around the fire event, and I don't hear people use the language of emergency so much as directly talking about the fire event itself, and not sort of generic language about it being an emergency. So I think what I was just, when Peter was speaking there, I was just sort of starting to think about, we talk about preparedness, we talk about response to the event, and then we talk about recovery. And it's almost like there's some different language that we're using at each of those phases. And then if we go back and think of what Natalia was talking about, we're also talking about the nature of the event and the frequency of the event. So those things, I think when Stuart was speaking, he was saying, we've got to sort of pull these things apart, but he didn't know how to put them back together. I think there is some layers of complexity here about how we're trying to engage the audience at that moment. What's the right language at that time for the audience that you're talking to? And I think my work is fundamentally with communities before an event. I mean, yes, I engage with them during events, but what I'm trying to do is say to people, become risk aware, understand you're living in an area of high, if I just speak bushfire for the moment, you're living in an area of high bushfire risk, and I try and get them to acknowledge that risk. I then try and educate them in terms of saying, well, how do I prepare and respond and plan for that hazard should that unfold? And then finally say, how do I translate that into something? How do I personalize that? And so then I use a different set of language when I'm trying to talk to them at a very personal level to say, well, look, where you live and what your risks are and what your hazards are, how do we turn that into something that's very personal for you? And so for me, I think I've got to use different languages at different times for different parts of that sequence of, preparedness through to the event.
Yeah.
Natalia,
I
there's no simplicity there, but it's complex, and I think it's ensuring that we're targeting our messaging, the language, to the audience that we're speaking with.
Yeah, and it's hazard specific.
Yes.
Natalia, I didn't get back to you with your question. Would you like to chime in?
That's totally fine. It's really nice to hear other perspective and opinion, because like I think emergency management, disaster management is really complex, and to hear from other like experiences, it's just like it's really enjoyable. And yeah, I just agree. Like me personally, like I just want to clarify a little bit about the community that living 5 kilometers for the volcano, that by they knowing about, they have that traditional knowledge about this volcano, so they know all the sign when the volcano will erupt even before the government asks them to evacuate themselves. So that's why they have really good mitigation and preparedness. And they never build their house for like really like a permanent structure, because they know one time their house just got destroyed, and then it's easier for them to build back after the event. Anyway, this make me thinking about, because they're really close with the event and they understand about the event, it's easier to talk about mitigation and preparedness. And sometimes I found when we're doing project to like community engagement about preparedness or talking about climate change, it's really hard because it's something that far away. Like the idea is too big to understand and how it will affect me directly. And I found Angelo and I doing some different project and community engagement, different style, different approach, that how we can communicate it in simple way to just the message that climate change is happening, and it will directly to like the frequency and the intensity of the natural hazard that you know maybe you never experience now, but why not just to prepare, because now no one can predict. That's, we really struggle. Then I'm sure like everyone who work in the local council have the same problem to just communicate that and how to just build the gap, which is like here to support to like doing capacity building and everything. But yeah, it's just like how languages matter, how to make all the simple messages matter, but also like how we translate a big thing about climate change to that really easy way. Yeah, just that from me. Thank you.
David, I'd be really interested to hear about the conversation that you had around the transition from Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC to Natural Hazards Research Australia. What was the conversation around the name for that organisation? Just to put into context for everyone else, NHRA is coming up to 2 years being established in July. So it's just gone through a very recent transition. And I'd imagine there was a lot of contemplation about the name.
Yeah, it was, and you'd be surprised how quickly we actually decided on the end, because it was just we basically exhausted all the conversations about what is the best word. We just worked out what works well and what resonates with people, and we had to get the word Australia in there. We had to get the word research in there, and it doesn't leave you with many options once you go beyond that. So we just went with natural hazards, with all its limitations and with all its problems. You know, with that we said let's just work with that, because we did actually try to be just hazards Australia, but then hazards is a much broader term, and it encompasses so many more things. So that's why we went with natural hazards, because people know what subject matter we are and what we're on about, i.e. research. But yeah, this is the limitations of the language. And I mean, and just the word emergency is a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, it's come up, and I can see when Scott brought it up for his local council thing, it really works at that level. What a lot of the research shows, and what we sort of know also, is that that's the time to talk to people. If you want to get people's attention, use words like emergency. And that's why our highest level of warning is an emergency warning, because suddenly everybody's listening. But we also know intuitively and by research is that if we really want to make an impact on natural hazards or emergencies, all the good action is done outside of the emergency. When the emergency is happening, that's not the time to really make a really big impact. It's all during preparation and the mitigation and a good recovery afterwards. I mean, what we're seeing now for example, an extreme example with the earthquake in Turkey, for example, horrific example there, but it's the way they built the buildings in a lot of the way there. There's nothing natural about the way they built the buildings, and their guidelines for building and their application and the monitoring of them. It's all about those building codes. So that ain't natural, and it ain't about climate. It's something else. It's something very human decision. And if you go back to when the UN started to say, let's not call them natural anymore, I reckon that's sort of what they were getting at.
Yeah.
No, it's the decisions that we're making. And
Yeah.
and we just did just quickly, we just did a research on, I think it was after Cyclone Yasi. I get my cyclones mixed up, but one of them, our researchers went into to see what houses were damaged and what weren't afterwards, after the big cyclone that roared through. There was a lot of houses damaged in it. They were all pre-modern code, building code, that was changed in the 80s and 90s. They were all the houses affected. Everything built with the newer code was absolutely okay. Now that tells you a great story that you can build better and you can do that. And that's about decisions that are human, that have got nothing to do with natural and got nothing to do with climate. It's just another layer to bring into it.
Yeah, and it's the dropping of the word natural adds a layer of accountability, doesn't it? It's sort of, if we can sort of get into that terminology, then we can sort of start making the development decisions a little bit more transparent. Glenn?
Yeah, I was just going to say, David said something interesting there about getting people engaged in, sort of preparing for the hazard. My experience is it takes a level, it takes time for the level of risk of that hazard to increase for people to actually feel they need to engage. And my experience from, bush, again, I speak, from bushfire, often it takes a little bit of smoke in the air for people to kind of think, gee, I've heard these guys saying I need to prepare, I should do something. Now, I don't mean we're in the middle of a major fire event, but we might have just had, a lightning strike in the national park. There's a bit of smoke in the valley, and people are aware that we've had a couple of small fire events. And I know then if I hold a community safety forum, I'll get many more people turn up than if I was to do it at this time of the year where we're, sort of just about to pop into autumn and people are feeling we're coming into a lovely time of the year. They're not starting to think about bushfire. So you've actually got to get closer to the event and the risk of that event for people actually to engage.
Yeah. Well, we've got 1 minute to go, so I'll go quickly around the room. What word would you like to see journalists using instead of natural disaster? So, Stuart, what's your option?
I don't know, to be honest. Pass.
Angela?
I don't know either, but I'm always puzzled at the different emphasis different states or regions put on. Some use disaster, some use emergency. I'd like just a bit of overall consistency, whatever it is.
David, what's your preference?
Well, I've spent so much money on the branding, so let's just stay with natural hazards, eh?
Glenn?
I'm going to stay with natural disaster because I think we've got to have a sharpness and an edge. A hazard still sounds like it might be over there. A disaster sounds like, bang, that could hit me and we need to do something about it.
Yep. Okay. Angelo?
I'm not sure. It's a tricky one.
Natalia?
I'm not sure either, but I used to with the natural disaster, but looking forward for how we will bring it to natural hazard. It make it easier to work and then better outcome, absolutely yes.
Yeah. Peter Randall, what's your idea?
Yeah, I think it depends on scale and time. I mean, that's my sort of immediate response. I don't think that people who are recovering from a disaster remain in an emergency or would term it an emergency. So I guess, disaster is what plays out afterwards. And I suppose if anything, crisis or people being in crises is what also plays out. So look, but I think I'm coming at it from a different angle really, Barbara. But if I was pushed, I would just say, just go disaster. Yeah.
Scott Walker?
I like Peter's comments, really. That was pretty insightful. So for me, emergency or disaster would be the top two.
Yeah. Scott Power. On mute, Scott.
I agree with the last speaker that because of climate change, we know that pretty much all the hazards we've been talking about today are exacerbated by climate change. So natural is not accurate anymore.
Yeah. I was concerned about the emergency not translating very well into recovery, so I'm going to go for disaster 2. So thank you all for an amazing conversation. It was really great. Adrienne from HPE will be in touch soon with a copy of the recording if you want to revisit. And coming up, we've got the EMPA annual conference in Brisbane, June 7 to 9. So if you like what you've seen here, very welcome to come up and visit us in Queensland. And watch out for our monthly webinars too. We generally have panels which attract a lot of people because they're so amazing. And thank you all again for coming. So have a great rest of the week. Bye.
Thanks, Barb. See you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Bye now.
Thank you.